Story 1. Francisco Solano Lopez was the leader of Paraguay who started a war against Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay simultaneously. The conflict was so disastrous that it cost Paraguay 60% of its population and left it with only 28,000 men in the entire country. Paraguay lost a quarter of its territory to the victorious nations and experienced such political instability that over the next 66 years it had 32 presidents, 2 major assassinations, 6 coups, and 8 failed revolutions. Story 2. There was a senior officer in the United States Civil War who was repeatedly captured and released by Union forces, Braxton Bragg, because he was so incompetent that having him freed and in command was considered preferable to risking someone else leading. He won a few minor battles early, was promoted far beyond his competence, and proved to be ineffective. Story 3. Gaius Flaminius knew Hannibal was dangerous during the Second Punic War. He ignored intelligence reporting he was outnumbered and ignored that his patrols had failed to report that morning because Hannibal had killed them during the night to reposition his army without Flaminius's knowledge. Flaminius then marched his army between a forest and a lake in heavy fog that prevented him from seeing any approaching enemy. He assumed Hannibal would stay in camp and let the Romans attack. His fellow consul begged him not to give battle, but Flaminius wanted glory and ordered the army forward. Hannibal's forces ambushed them from the forest in the fog and drove the Romans into the lake in a massive slaughter. This was the Battle of Trasimene. Story 4. Luigi Cadorna led the Italian army to a disastrous defeat in World War I, repeatedly hurling men into a meat grinder 11 times at Isonzo. This blog post provides a clear, very readable summary. Story 5. The Russian Baltic Fleet versus Japan. Whoever started this, and the admiral who continued, should accept a few small failures before becoming an example of what not to do. Story 6. An airman who posted military secrets to a Discord server just to win a stupid argument with teenagers and others is now in prison for espionage and treason because of his reckless actions. Story 7. Ala al-Din Muhammad. When Genghis Khan asks you to trade and you respond by killing the messenger and all of the merchants, you are going to have a bad time. Story 8. The installation formerly known as Fort Bragg was named after one of the most notoriously unsuccessful military strategists in American history. Story 9. Not the biggest idiot ever, but I bet most of you have never heard of him. Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, commander of the Austro-Hungarian army in the early years of World War I. Austria-Hungary's army in 1914 was underfunded, poorly equipped, badly trained, and short on artillery, uniforms, and basic supplies. The officers were brave but inept, and the rank and file were mostly reluctant conscripts from subject peoples who were neither trained nor fit. Conrad believed he could turn that army into a victory and apparently thought he was Napoleon. He was good at making plans but had little skill at actual command. He tried to invade Serbia and Russia at the same time despite lacking the manpower to do either properly. An entire army was sent to the Serbian front. When they arrived, they were told, "Actually, we need you to go to Russia soon, so don't unpack." He also failed to coordinate plans with the Germans, so German operations assumed the Austrians would be doing things Conrad had no intention of doing. Unsurprisingly, the campaign quickly failed. Conrad ordered repeated frontal attacks against Russian and Serbian guns, producing massive casualties that Austria could not replace. He had been one of the loudest voices demanding war in the first place, knew the army was in poor condition, and went to war anyway, making everything far worse. What a fool. Story 10. What about the man who nearly started a war with Britain over a pig? Story 11. The infographics show and Simple History made videos about this. It was probably a South American leader who started a war with all his neighbors and caused about 90% of men of military age and 66% of the general population to be killed. Story 12. It may not have had the worst lasting effects, but L. Ron Hubbard reportedly fired on a Mexican island because he thought it was a ship or mistook a log for a submarine. He claimed he knew what both objects were and said it was just target practice, but the island had people on it and he nearly committed an act of war against Mexico. This occurred after he had already been stationed off the coast of California because he was considered too incompetent to be sent into actual combat. Story 13. The officer who led his Japanese troops into a crocodile-infested swamp and lost almost 1,000 of his men. Story 14. During a marksmanship test, I accidentally shot at the wrong target. I was yelled at and made fun of for it. Then, on the next round, I did it again. The range instructors could not believe it. No one in military history is dumber than that. I'll take my crown now if you don't mind. Story 15. As a New Zealander, I am here to remind you that Australia lost a war against the emus twice. Story 16. The Grand Old Duke of York had 10,000 men. He marched them up a hill, and when they were up, he marched them all down again. Story 17. A personal favorite is Leonidas Polk, a Confederate general in the Western theater of the American Civil War. He was an Episcopal bishop with little military experience, but he was friends with President Jefferson Davis, so he received a commission and remained in command throughout the war despite repeated attempts by his superior, the controversial Braxton Bragg, to remove him. His exploits include: 1. He sent troops into neutral Kentucky, which spurred the state to reject the Confederacy and request federal protection. 2. He argued with his superiors about strategy. 3. He ignored orders to attack at the Battle of Perryville. 4. He oversaw slow, piecemeal attacks at the Battle of Stones River that allowed his divisions to suffer severe casualties one at a time. 5. He feuded with his commanding general, Braxton Bragg, and actively tried to have him removed. 6. He ignored orders to attack before the Battle of Chickamauga. 7. He ignored orders to attack on the second day at Chickamauga. He was supposed to begin the army's attack at dawn but did not. According to one account, when Bragg sent an aide several hours later to ask why, Polk replied that he was waiting for breakfast and would attack after breakfast. He was killed after conferring with several other generals in an area exposed to Union artillery. One historian described his death as one of the worst shots fired for the Union cause during the war. Despite being an insubordinate nepotistic appointee who performed poorly, his men loved him. Story 18. Probably a lesser-known figure in the West, a Korean commander named Won Jae-un is remembered for a major failure. Some may know Admiral Lee Sun-sin, Won Jae-un's predecessor. Won Jae-un led the same fleet that Lee had used to defeat the Japanese Navy without a single loss, but he lost it all in one disastrous battle. Won Jae-un also died in that battle, and the king of Joseon had to recall Lee Sun-sin from punishment as a common foot soldier to take action. Ironically, Lee Sun-sin's greatest victory came after that disaster at Myeongyang, with only a handful of the battered survivors of the routed fleet. Story 19. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna set the stage for his own defeat after the fall of the Alamo and the Goliad massacre by allowing himself and his soldiers a midday siesta on April 21, 1836. The enraged Texan forces surprised them while they slept, and the rout began. Story 20. Hitler was adept at ignoring facts and moving fake armies to attack real foes. Story 21. L. Ron Hubbard was comically bad as a naval commander during World War II. Story 22. Horatio, Lord Kitchener. He did not like to have his orders to others written down because he did not want his whims of the moment contradicted by anything, not even by a piece of paper he had written previously. Story 23. Custer's last words were, "Where the fuck did all these Indians come from?" Story 24. Louis Mountbatten was called the Master of Disaster by many people in the Royal Navy for his antics during World War II. Story 25. Darius III underestimated Alexander at Issus in 333 before Common Era. This was followed by the total destruction of the Persian Empire because he believed there was no need to protect Persepolis. I guess this counts as one of the biggest losses in history. Story 26. All I know is never get involved in a land war in Asia. Story 27. Stalin decapitated his entire military leadership in the purges from 1936 to 1938, and then allowed Hitler to start World War II and move his troops eastward in 1939. Story 28. Can I just add John Sedgwick, if only for his rather wonderful, stupid death? He was at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, stuck his head above the parapet to check the enemy sharpshooters, and exclaimed, "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." Story 29. Commodore Stephen Decatur Jr. participated in one of the most ill-advised duels in American history against another Commodore. He asked his best friend to serve as his second. The friend refused, warning him not to proceed. Decatur then asked a man who had been openly hostile toward and jealous of him to act as his second. The seconds agreed on the terms. 1. The men would start at 8 paces instead of 10. 2. Both men would begin with their pistols drawn and aimed. 3. They could fire only after the count of 2 and before the count of 5. Both men shot each other. They apologized to one another in agony and died. Story 30. General William George Keith Elphinstone of the First Anglo-Afghan War was responsible for the 1842 retreat from Kabul in which 4,500 troops and 12,000 civilians were lost. Only one European reached friendly territory. First, he abandoned the sick and wounded who were promptly killed. Next, he refused to fall back to a defensible position when it was clear the Afghans would not provide the food, fuel, and safe passage previously negotiated for the retreat. He lost or destroyed all of the group's artillery within the first 24 hours. He then tried to negotiate again with the same groups who had already betrayed him. They were stalling to gain a better position to attack. This occurred in winter in the Afghan mountains, and many froze to death. By the 4th day, he stopped issuing orders. By the 5th day, the army of 4,500 men had been reduced to 200. When Elphinstone again attempted to negotiate, he was taken captive along with his second-in-command. He died months later while still in captivity. Story 31. The combined efforts of William Westmoreland and Robert McNamara were disastrous. McNamara may not have been an idiot per se, but his statistical approach to strategy in Vietnam and Westmoreland's adoption of search and destroy tactics were the most misguided way to try to win a war in modern history. Who would waste lives seizing ground only to withdraw immediately afterward? Story 32. Major General Elphinstone commanded an army of 4,500, plus about 12,000 support and other personnel. Every last one of them was massacred in January 1842. See the Wikipedia article or Flashman by George MacDonald Fraser. Story 33. My criticism is not only for the atrocities he committed, but for his strategic errors. He undermined accomplished military leaders, in particular Erwin Rommel, because Rommel did not carry out orders the way Hitler wanted despite significant successes against the Allies. His most serious strategic error was invading the Soviet Union, with which Germany had a non-aggression pact. This effectively split German forces and made the Allied invasion of Normandy inevitable. Story 34. Definitely not me because I have never been defeated in a battle or a war. Story 35. Caligula. Emperor Caligula made many bizarre decisions during his reign. One was declaring war on the god of the sea, Neptune. He ordered his soldiers to go to the beach, stab the sea with their swords, and throw spears at the waves. Story 36. Gaius Claudius Glaber was a military commander of the late Roman Republic who held the office of praetor in 73 before Christ. During his term, he was defeated in the Battle of Mount Vesuvius against the forces of Spartacus in the Third Servile War. His force of Roman militia, not professional legionaries, was destroyed because he failed to adapt to the gladiators' unorthodox tactics. After Glaber besieged the slaves on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, he did not anticipate their next move. Spartacus's forces used rappelling lines made from local vegetation to descend the cliffs on the opposite side of the mountain, outflanking and annihilating Glaber's militia. Story 37. Putin is the biggest idiot of all time. It is day 1023 of his 3-day war. He expanded the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, freed Syria, destroyed the Russian army, and all but crashed the ruble and the economy. Reserves have dwindled to the point where 18-year-old Russians now die in 60-year-old tanks, and 60-year-olds are dying in the trenches. Russia is now, and possibly forever, a pariah state. History has shown that dictators are untouchable until they are not. It won't be much longer before either the Federal Security Service or the oligarchs cut their losses and start looking for the nearest unlocked window. When it happens, it will be fast. 8 meters per second squared. Story 38. Putin's special operation looks really dumb from where I am standing. Story 39. George McClellan. Not only was he inept enough to make observers think he was trying to lose, but he also showed no self-reflection. He could have ended the American Civil War years earlier and spared many lives, but he refused because he believed the Confederates had more soldiers than his army, although everyone else knew this was not the case. Later in the war, he ran against Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election, and his victory would probably have been the only way the Confederacy could have won. Story 40. Churchill. The Battle of Gallipoli was an unmitigated disaster. He botched Operation R4, the occupation of Norway. Operation Catapult, the sinking of the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, alienated the French. If Operation Pike, the bombing and destruction of the Soviet oil fields at Baku, had gone ahead as envisioned by Churchill, World War II could have taken a very different course. Brooke himself called Churchill a public menace, diary entry of September 10, 1944, and wrote, "Without him, England was lost for a certainty, but with him we stood on the precipice of disaster time and again, same diary entry." Story 41. Tommy Frank said he did not need to think about what would happen after he captured Baghdad. Earlier he said he had been laden-pinned at Tora Bora and that he could trust the local warlords to cover the Pakistani border. Story 42. George Armstrong Custer surely makes this list. Custer's last stand is such an ingrained piece of history that it is synonymous with failure. Little Bighorn was on the history curriculum when I was at school in the United Kingdom. Story 43. The sailors aboard the Kamchatka during the Russo-Japanese War. Story 44. Late in World War II, Japan pursued increasingly desperate and rash policies, from what I recall. They formed ad hoc units and sometimes refused to acknowledge ship losses. There were no radios on Zero fighters, if I recall. Supplies were minimal, often only a bag of rice with soldiers expected to procure the rest themselves. There was social Darwinism and infighting between army groups. Story 45. Probably the poor corporal who ran the Fort Bragg Twitter account and sent sexual tweets to the OnlyFans model. Story 46. Muhammad II of Khwarezm refused Genghis Khan's requests for trade and executed his merchants and later his envoys. In response, Genghis Khan launched a devastating invasion that destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire. Story 47. Let me introduce you to Antonio López de Santa Anna. He was president of Mexico during the 19th century. He lost a leg fighting the French and ordered a ceremony to bury it. During the American invasion, American troops took the leg and reportedly played baseball with it. He lost the war to keep Texas, was captured, and later ceded nearly half of Mexico's territory. He is considered one of Mexico's most infamous presidents. Story 48. General George Custer once shot his own horse out from under him while hunting deep in Native American territory and had to walk back to camp. Story 49. I'm surprised no one said Putin. His 3-day war has been horrific. 1. I'd have picked a different location for his pre-invasion buildup. He allowed satellite information to prepare Ukraine. 2. I'd have had embedded agents in Ukraine long before repositioning the army. The paratrooper failure is astonishing. As far as modern warfare goes, he's an idiot. He has reasons that few people understand. I think people do not understand why he is all in and why this could go nuclear. The Russian withdrawal from the Mediterranean is almost complete. Maybe this will calm things down. My suspicion is that this has been the strategic goal all along. Story 50. Lloyd Fredendall was responsible for the fiasco at Kasserine Pass and spent the rest of the war stateside in training commands. He was replaced by George Patton, who initially sympathized with Fredendall but, after seeing how much of his new command was in disarray, remarked, "I cannot see what Fredendall did to justify his existence." Story 51. Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall. He spoke in codes and riddles to his men, apparently paranoid that the Germans were listening. The entire North Africa campaign was stalled by his gross incompetence, and he was reassigned to the Second Army in the United States to supervise the training of inexperienced recruits. By the time he returned to the United States, the war was over, and he received a hero's welcome because Eisenhower omitted Fredendall's failings as a commander in his reports to President Roosevelt. Story 52. General Elphinstone must be counted among them. People call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires largely because of him, under whose command an entire British army was massacred during the retreat from Kabul. Story 53. The Roman commanders at Cannae were defeated. It has been 2,300 years since that battle, and no general has lost as many men in a single day in all that time. Story 54. Marcus Licinius Crassus was a general of the Roman Republic. The Battle of Carrhae was an embarrassment. Story 55. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Mexican general and president during the Mexican-American War. He lost 50% of Mexico's territory, much of it sparsely populated. He led a country still reeling from independence and internal conflict against a more consolidated United States Army. It is the only time in Mexican history that foreign troops marched on Mexico City. One factor in the fall of the Alamo was the exposed position of some defenders, which allowed a surprise assault. He also lost a leg and held a public funeral for it. In a country with many ineffective leaders, he stands out. Story 56. A top contender is the officer who commanded a group of United States troops stationed in England during World War II. White troops tried to force the nearby English town to institute segregation and were told to go away. Black troops were treated like actual people by the English, which angered the white troops. They nearly started a war with England by attempting to shoot the black soldiers and the English defenders who were protecting them. Story 57. Yahya Sinwar and Muhammad Deif invaded Israel to take hostages as leverage. This caused the total destruction of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Syrian regime. Story 58. Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose armored column came within a few garbage trucks of the Moscow Kremlin, withdrew and was reported killed 2 months later. Story 59. James Brudenell, 7th Earl of Cardigan, is definitely up there for the idiotic charge of the Light Brigade. Story 60. Robert E. Lee may not have been the biggest idiot, but I think he is the most overhyped figure in American military history. Yes, he was racist and a slave owner, but he also did not win many battles and was usually on the defensive. He was not a good strategist, and many of his decisions, such as leading the Confederate Army in the first place, were motivated by personal prejudices. The largely accepted position is that he might have been a bad person, as if that exists in a vacuum, but he was a brilliant military leader. He was not Grant's mirror or equal opposite, as people believe. He was a poor commander and a bad general. Story 61. Hitler's decision to invade Russia. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor. In my humble opinion, the two biggest screw-ups in military history both literally changed the future of the world, and they happened in the same war. Remarkable. Story 62. The team that assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand unexpectedly started World War I, despite turning the event into a Looney Tunes episode. Story 63. Glad you asked this here and not the subreddit Ask Historians. Those jagoffs will not allow a comment without thesis-level citations. I understand not allowing half-truths and outright lies, but that subreddit will delete every comment that lacks obscure citations. You cannot learn anything there by using your own judgment to discern unverifiable sources. Story 64. Benedict Arnold would have been an American hero if, well, you know. Story 65. I'm gonna go with George McClellan, who needed to be fired well before Lincoln finally did. Talk about continually stalling action. YouTube has a great documentary on generals who were simply ineffective. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.